Welcome, everybody. The Southern Alliance for Clean Energy is pleased to host the Southeast Coastal Climate Network's webinar series. Today's webinar is titled Making Climate Change Local and Personal. On behalf of SACE and the Southeast Coastal Climate Network, I'd like to thank you for attending today. It is your interest and support that make our work possible. My name is Erin Cameron, and I'll be the acting facilitator for today's webinar. I'd like to just take one moment before we get started and review your control panel that you see on your screen. You have two options for joining the audio with us today, and that's telephone and mic and speakers through your computer. So just make sure you have your chosen mode selected on your control panel. And if you'd like to minimize your control panel, just select this orange arrow that you see right here, and then you can select that again to display your control panel on your screen. All of our lines are muted for this presentation, so we ask and encourage you to please chat in your questions using your control panel, and then the questions will be fielded in the order they are received when we are through with the presentation today. So I would now like to turn the presentation over to Chris Carnevale, SACE Coastal Climate and Energy Coordinator and Manager of the Southeast Coastal Climate Network.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you everyone for attending the webinar today. My name is Chris Carnevale, and I'm the manager of the Southeast Coastal Climate Network. As you can see on the current slide, the Southeast Coastal Climate Network is a coalition of individuals and organizations spanning the coastal Southeast who are working on coastal responses to climate change. We have members as far north as Maryland and as far west as Louisiana. The purpose of the network is to bring voices together, to trade information, and to synergize our efforts. The Southeast Coastal Climate Network is hosted under the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. Our largest tool is our group site website, which is an online platform that enables members to send group emails, post discussion topics, or relevant news to discussion boards, and use a shared group calendar. If you're interested in joining the network and using these tools, please visit the web address on the screen now, seccn.groupsite.com, and click Join This Group Now. For those of you on the webinar who are already members, I want to encourage you to use these tools to help get your message out. The purpose of the group is to encourage communication and collaboration, and you have a receptive group of people at your fingertips. So please don't be shy, and please do use these web tools. Another great tool we have is our webinar series, of which today's webinar is a part. Today we're joined by Ben Kalina for a presentation titled Making Climate Change Local and Personal. Ben Kalina is a documentary filmmaker whose work is at the juncture of science, the environment, and the human experience along the front lines of climate change. Shored Up is his feature directing debut. He was the associate producer of the documentaries A Sea Change about ocean acidification and broadcast on Discovery's Planet Green in 2009, and 2 Square Miles, about a small town's fight to prevent a coal-fired cement plant from building in their midst, broadcast on PBS's Independent Lens in 2006. Ben and his company, Mangrove Media, are located in Philadelphia, where he lives with his family. With that, I'll turn it over to Ben.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Erin. Hello, everyone. I'm, as Chris said, Ben Kalina, and I'm the director and producer of Shored Up, which is a documentary, broadly speaking, about coastal development, sea level rise, and storms, Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy in particular. And it's focused primarily in New Jersey, Long Beach Island, and Union Beach, and in North Carolina. So I'm going to circle back around to the film in a bit, but first I want to talk a little bit about how I came to make the film and why I approached it the way I did. So before I directed Shored Up, as Chris said, I was the associate producer on a couple of environmentally themed films, 2 Square Miles and A Sea Change. And both were feature length, both were broadcast nationally, and through these projects and others, I started to spend a lot of time with scientists and ecologists and so on. And I actually have some really good friends from growing up who are scientists, but I am not a scientist. And I'm kind of, maybe not the farthest thing from it, but I'm pretty far from it. I was bad at science in high school. I never really got it. And I'm not saying this to brag about my ignorance or anything like that, but mostly because I think it's important to my approach as a filmmaker that I'm someone who is constantly learning and interpreting and then trying to find the best ways to explain what I've learned to the person next to me. I ask questions even if I think I'm going to be wrong or they sound stupid, of scientists. I try not to censor myself, and I try to remember the ideas and concepts that I found a little confusing when I get into the editing room and I have to decide what the audience needs to know, of all the information. It's an empathetic process. So I try to keep in mind that for many people, science is scary, And global warming and sea level rise are even more terrifying, and they should be. And I think when you work on climate change issues a lot, when you think about it all the time in either an academic or activist advocate context, we get a little numb and forget that when you're only vaguely aware of the impacts of climate change and the science behind it, learning more can be very paralyzing. All you have to do is really think of reading the headlines from the recent IPCC reports that have been coming out in the last few weeks. It's enough to make you want to crawl into a hole. And people might understand the scientific phenomenon, that they might understand the phenomenon that drive these processes, like the greenhouse effect, but it's more than likely that they don't, sadly, and because the consequences still seem far off people, it's a lot easier to just ignore it, to focus on the present, to avoid it altogether. I don't think this is news to anyone who's working in this field, but most people don't think in 30, 50, 100-year timescales. So this is where I think we have to be as communicators, or at least where I feel like I have to be, which is explaining how the impacts of climate change are connected to the fabric of our identity, our economy, our communities, not in the distant future, but today. So that moment of connection for me came when I was about 12 years old. I grew up in Vermont in a ski lodge run by my parents. I skied a lot, and being in and around an industry that's completely weather dependent, I understood how a few degrees Fahrenheit can mean the difference between a snowstorm and a washout, especially when that happens right before the all-important holiday season, which can make the difference between a successful year and a disaster of a year. So when I read an article about global warming for the first time, what struck me was that this thing that I love to do, which was in large part how I define myself, that's skiing, and the industry that supported my family, and the ecology of the place that I love were all at risk. I think that article pointed out that sometime later in my life, we could be looking at a temperature shift of a few degrees Fahrenheit. And so I've been on sort of a personal obsession or a crusade thinking about this for the last 25 years, which makes me close to 40, which is where I am, talking to people about climate change through film more recently, but also just one-on-one. And I'll say, I think as many of you probably know, climate change can be a great way to kill a social conversation. Which brings me to the central point of my talk, which is, why should I care? Not me, I care, but that's a question that a lot of people, I think, wonder or think or muse on. How do you get past the polite, disinterested nods when you talk to people about climate change issues like sea level rise, which seem like issues that everyone should care about? To reach people, the stories we tell have to resonate with their lives. It has to get beyond the abstract. Film provides some good lessons here. The first of which in film is show, don't tell, meaning instead of using expository styles of filmmaking where you're kind of talking, explaining what's happening, you have to show them, helping them to connect with present tense drama, people, character, conflict. Why this story and why now is another important question that you consider before you make a film. And all that came together as I sketched out my approach to Short Up. My goal was to find a front line in climate change, a place where we could see glimpses of the kinds of physical and cultural impacts that would be unfolding in the future, today. Some place where individuals are observing climate change happening, but where they may not have the language to describe it, someplace on the edge, someplace vulnerable. What better place than a barrier island? And that's where I settled, Long Beach Island. It was actually initially inspired by an article I read about surfing in the Army Corps of Engineers, but we'll get back to that. Most people probably don't know when they're on a barrier island that they're on a barrier island when they get there, and I'm pretty sure that maybe at least 90% aren't aware that barrier islands are actually just mobile piles of sand in the ocean. That's not usually the pitch from realtors, right? So I knew that part of this project was going to be simply providing a different perspective on the geology. We need context for the development here, considering what we're building on. Whether or not we knew what we were doing when we developed these islands, we know a lot more now, and we're in a tough spot. These aren't the seasonal communities of the early 20th century. It's not so easy to rebuild them after a storm. But I didn't want to make a film blaming developers and alienating most of my audience. It's not about litigating the past or making people feel guilty. So I started out with what was a small local story about New Jersey's barrier islands and coastal development through the eyes of surfers whose surf breaks were being buried by the Army Corps beach replenishment projects. That was the initial conflict. There aren't many people who understand and respect the power of storms better than the winter surfers of New Jersey, who are kind of weather junkies of their own stripe. They're always out looking for a good nor'easter and the swell that follows it. And those are the storms that transform these islands as well, slowly sometimes and other times quickly. And so beach engineering was that conflict, the starting point for the film. This is a project that's become sort of the routine maintenance of barrier island coastal communities. You know, I found it, and I'm sorry for the low res on this image here, but I found it to be really just kind of compelling slice of life. You know, this is what we do to keep these islands in place. And from here, I began to connect this small local tale to the challenges that face other regions, and broadening it out to a global perspective with sea level rise science as the catalyst. So for 3 years shooting, this was a story about the past and the future, grounded in the present. We were exploring the cycles of storms that had hit the Northeast and Long Beach Island in particular over the past century and the pattern of development that followed. And that was Jen, my cinematographer there. So I was out on the islands every nor'easter, trying, you know, and near miss with a hurricane, looking for that moment visually that would illustrate what the film was suggesting about the risks of coastal development and sea level rise. And then Sandy happened. And this is a slide from Union Beach, where part of where the film ended up after the storm. Suddenly, you know, this film that was suggesting what would happen in the future if we didn't alter our course had a very visceral object lesson, to put it mildly, which underscored just how poorly we were prepared for a storm like Sandy and for future sea level rise. Sandy leveled homes, neighborhoods, submerged entire communities. The film, which was very close to finished at this point, took another turn here, and with a few more days of shooting, it became what ultimately is now. And now I'm going to play the trailer for you, the film, so you have a little bit of a sense.
I think people are just really attracted to water.
We've always liked to live along the coast.
We have billions and billions of dollars that come into this country every year because of spending along the coast.
We're all here because the beach is there. You know, if there's no beach here or we're washing away, there is no town.
We're now moving into the 21st century, where our rate of sea level rise is far greater than we've seen over the last 2,000 years.
The water level is coming up a little bit faster, a little bit faster, a little bit faster.
And people can't imagine how the ocean could take away entire buildings and structures.
I started coming here as a kid in the 60s. It was a forest. Now it's practically a desert.
They don't understand the power of water.
We have reworked that piece of legislation dealing with the sea level rise.
North Carolina Republicans immediately addressed the crisis predicted by these climate models by outlawing the climate models.
Problem solved.
Now it's pretty difficult to fight Mother Nature because nature wants to do something else.
They're calling it Frankenstorm. Hurricane Sandy is about to crash into 2 other systems when it makes landfall.
This is going to be a big and powerful storm.
One day everything's normal. You're cooking, you're cleaning, you're schooling, you're shopping, and then the next day it's gone.
If the sea level rise rate continues, there will be changes of major proportion everywhere on the planet.
It's undeniable there is a wake-up call here that this could happen again.
We shouldn't just go forward blind. We can begin thinking about the future.
In an ideal world, this wouldn't have happened in the first place, but we're all here now.
You are a part of something that is so much bigger than yourself.
So there it is. Excuse me. Okay, well, after Sandy, how are coastal communities dealing with sea level rise? I've been on tour at the film now for over a year since we finished it. It's nearly every state on the East Coast and across the country. Most screenings include one or more experts in addition to myself to help connect, not that I'm an expert, to help connect the film to local issues. And there's patterns I've been noticing in how different communities are dealing with sea level rise and climate change. It's probably obvious, but how people perceive the threat and the time horizon for the impacts of sea level rise is essential to creating action or consensus building process. Immediacy, this idea again of the present tense drama, or conflict. Political leadership, or at least politicians who are dealing with reality beyond the next election, are essential here. And you see a real difference from state to state, both from the governor's level in certain states, and also just from the city and county level, which there are a lot of differences there. And we'll get to this later. Anyways, what can also make a big difference is whether science and scientists are at the table, and often the role that scientists can play in bridging between various stakeholders by interpreting science, answering questions, in other words, communicating. But one of the things that I've come to understand over the last few years, and in this year in particular, over the course of traveling with the film and making the film, which is so discouraging, is how much pressure and intimidation scientists are experiencing from politicians and outside groups. It's the politicization of science. And when I decided to visit North Carolina, I expected to find a forward-looking counterpoint to New Jersey's history of coastal hardening and development. That was what we were going to use in the film to counter the sort of process that New Jersey had taken over 100 years. But instead, what I found was the unraveling of 30 years of consensus-driven science and policy, driven by those with a political and profit-motivated agenda. And you're looking at the website here, the NC20, who are, kind of in the zeitgeist in North Carolina right now. Anyways, they're very much front and center in the conversation debate that's going on there. And because of all this, I had to practically beg Stan Riggs to be in the film. I mean, he's the most prominent local geomorphologist in addition to Orrin Pilkey in North Carolina, but he didn't know who I was, and he was concerned about being on camera because of the pressure, emails, and other kinds of it's various shades of pressure and intimidation that he and his grad students had gotten from interest groups, denialists, and others. I'm not saying specifically from NC20, but from similar groups. And after the film was finished, the North Carolina Museum of Science decided not to show it after their program committee had agreed to show it. And this became kind of a big deal for the film, and has led to actually, a lot more interest in North Carolina in the film ultimately. But I think ultimately, from what I understand, this was a pretty clear case of self-censorship. They were worried about their funding given the political situation right now in the legislature in North Carolina. But when politicians, community members, and others can accept what's happening around them as reality and invite scientists to the table to look for consensus, that's when there can be a long-term vision. And as I've been traveling, I've seen a range of regional responses to sea level rise. In some states like Maryland, where sea level rise is acute, political leadership and strong collaboration between the governor and the DEP have led to much improved disaster responses and also long-term coastal development planning, because these things are really connected. And money's being guided to where it will have a long-term impact and diverted from locations that may not actually even exist in 30 to 50 years. And then other states like Maine are just getting introduced to the conversation. Florida, you've got really strong regional compacts, but the governor's office really couldn't be more antagonistic to this conversation. Because each state has its own geology and built environment along the coast, and each has its own unique political identity, it seems they're all going to approach this differently. But I think because federal money isn't going to be there equally and forever to address sea level rise, ultimately each state and even each region is going to have to be in control of their own destiny. And this was how New Jersey, what I'm about to show you here, just shows to respond rhetorically to Sandy and sea level rise. It sounds like there may not be anyone from New Jersey as a part of this coalition, so this may be new to you, but if you're anywhere in the tri-state region, you saw this commercial a lot.
It's in our blood, our DNA. It's who we are, we're here to stay. Toughness, confidence.
The Jersey Shore is open.
The word is spreading because we're stronger than the storm.
You said we are.
So there's actually some sort of federal investigation into whether or not there's a misappropriation of funds for that commercial, because Chris Christie was in the middle of a re-election campaign, and that was federal Sandy relief money that was used to make that commercial. But there's basically, as to say, there's a lot of politics involved. But there's also a lot of good sentiments in there, solidarity and perseverance and unity and resilience. But the message is that I think pretty clear is that, you know, in New Jersey, we're going to rebuild our communities. We are not going to retreat. And this is clearly a response to Sandy rather than a strategy for the future. It doesn't activate people's imaginations to find long-term solutions. It's more about freezing the shore in time, defending our memories and sentimental attachments to the way things were, and setting ourselves up, I would argue, for the same disasters in the next storm in the future. You know, I've gotten to know and care about a lot of people on the Jersey Shore in the process of making this film, and I like the idea of Stronger Than the Storm, but the more analytical part of me thinks the next campaign should be Smarter Than the Storm. So I'm just going to show you a couple of pictures here that I've found interesting. They're visions of what a different approach to barrier island development might look like in the future. There are some winners of design competitions. There are sort of hurricane-proof buildings and buildings that are, you know, also have a low carbon footprint. This is an interesting one by a man named Stephen Yablon, sort of an elevated community over Barrier Island. Obviously, it's pretty fanciful and not really what anyone would think of as a quaint beach house, but you know, it's about sort of thinking outside of the way that we, you know, have typically thought of being on the coast, on the beach. Here's another vision of what future Barrier Island development might look like. It's a lot like the past before we had the development. There's nothing there, and you know, I think that the conversation about sea level rise that we need to have, you know, has to encompass a really just a whole different way of thinking about what it means to live on the edge and on the coast. And what we're going to do about it all has slowly begun to enter the public discourse in certain areas more than others, thanks in large part to Hurricane Sandy and in the slowly growing understanding and acknowledgement of climate change and its impacts. But what's clear to me is that this is a situation where long-term planning is key to the survival of towns and cities all along the coasts, many of which, from what I've gleaned, are essentially going to be on their own. In the sense that, you know, there are going to be a limited number of times that the government comes in with the kind of aid packages that they did after Sandy, after Katrina, et cetera. I mean, these aren't going to last forever. And finding ways to bring this dialogue and conversation to really every coastal community is really critical. It's like one way to think about it is saving for retirement, and that if we want to have anything left, and you know, in that case, money, in this case, you know, land resources, that we need to start making hard choices now. You know, and a little deferred gratification here. People have to understand enough of the science to recognize what we're facing, the scale of it, and how it will impact them personally, their neighbors, their friends, and that in many places, the very existence of the communities that they live in now, within 2 to 3 generations, that the question of their actual existential existence is in our hands today. And the sooner we start making and having really the complicated, difficult conversations, the sooner we can, you know, start turning ourselves in a direction that's a bit more sustainable. So yeah, that's about it for my talk, and I'm happy to take questions.
Great. All right. Well, we are going to move into a question and answer period. Ben, thank you so much for the presentation. It was really wonderful. If anyone wants to submit questions, you can do that via the control panel on the right-hand side of the screen. Just go ahead and type them in, and I will see them as they come in. And we have a few questions. Oh, Ben, sorry. Did I cut you off before you got through the slide?
No, I forgot. You didn't cut me off, but let me mention it quickly. You know, one of the things is that this film is really meant to be a, it's meant to be a film and entertaining, but also meant to be used as much as possible, stimulate conversation. Just to give you a sense, the film itself is 84 minutes. We have a 60-minute version. We have an educational DVD that's got some wonderful lesson plans developed by UNC Wilmington. And there's some info on the screen here. We also have a newsletter that goes out very occasionally, and I promise no spam, but it'd be great if you wanted to sign up for it on our website. It'll also tell you about my future projects. And there's a lot of contact info on here. We do a lot of community screenings. I do travel a lot with the film, and you know, we do have a pretty robust educational program with it. So all that info is up on the screen here, I think they'll send it to you separately.
Okay, great. So if you want to sign up for Ben's very occasional newsletter, you can get to him at shoredupmovie.com, and we will send that link out with our follow-up email after this webinar. So again, if you have any questions, please type them in the control panel on the right-hand side of the screen, and we will answer them as they come in. So first question is, how can people arrange for a screening of the film in their community? And you actually just kind of went over that. But second part is, have you found any common themes of what makes a successful screening?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one of the most important things is that there's a group involved, whether it's a school or a active, grassroots organization that has membership that can drive people to a screening. It's kind of like a tree falling in the woods scenario, and you need to make sure that there's somebody who can spread the word about it. It may seem obvious, but it's not always. It's hard to get people out to a screening of any kind. There's just so much competing for their attention. The other thing that's really important, I think, is to try to have. It's great for me to be there. I think that's always a draw to have the director there, and I can speak somewhat articulately about these issues. But it's also really important to have somebody else who's either a local expert or a local politician or a local or an expert who's local who has more of a global perspective, and oftentimes more than one person. I can do a Q&A on my own, but I've been on Q&As with as many as 4 or 5 people, and 5 might be pushing it, but I think really people come, and the film, I think, from what I've understood and what I've seen, raises a lot of questions for people, and you want to have people who can field those questions, because people really want to ask about these things after they see the film. So those are some of the things I'd say.
Okay, great. From your tours, what are the things that have surprised you or interested you about the public's response to the film? And does it vary much from place to place?
It does vary a bit. I think that, sorry, that's just, hold on. There's, what you get is, it's interesting. I think one of the things that I've been really surprised by, ultimately, is that people are, regardless of where I show the film, as long as I'm anywhere near the coast, people get the issues. They connect it to their local issues. Sometimes it's because there's beach replenishment going on. Sometimes it's because they've had, storms. They have a historic storm that they remember, or they just have the gradual erosion problems. I've actually just been really surprised, because the film is really pretty, specifically situated in New Jersey and North Carolina, that, Florida, it was as if you could just take me out from one place to the other blindfolded, and I wouldn't really know that we weren't in North Carolina per se. But when the other side to it is that even when I've shown the film in, say, Kansas, which couldn't possibly be more landlocked, people have a connection both to the coast, but also to the idea of risk and the idea of climate, and those two things together. That what is, I think, universal about this is the idea that we are in a period of time and entering a period of time when there's going to be a whole lot of variability in the in our climate systems, and that the more we understand that, the more in this case, we're spending a lot of money in probably one of the most dynamic places on Earth, the coast and barrier islands in particular, to try to hold things in place in a way that makes us, both as supporting the invested infrastructure, the money that's already there, but also just in something that has to do with sort of our perception of time and time scales and how things and change. And as we enter into a period of much more dynamic change, where droughts are affecting large parts of the country, we're in addition to these other issues with coastal erosion and sea level rise, we're going to be asked, and we're going to have to make decisions about where we spend money. And I think that is a theme that the film pretty strongly hints at. And I think that that's something that comes up one way or the other, no matter where I show it, is just, it's not just outrage at, oh my God, why are we spending so much money on these barrier islands? It's also asking people to think about, the similar parallels in the places that they live. And so, yeah, I mean, I think people are very, concerned when they watch the film, one way or the other.
Great, and that actually dovetails nicely with two of our other questions. Let's go through them one at a time, though. One is, a lot of homeowners on the coast are from out of state.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any recommendations besides what you just said for reaching them?
For reaching the people who are out of state?
Out of state
yeah.
coastal homeowners.
Well, right. So that point's made in the film that, pretty strongly, that there's actually a pretty significant, dichotomy between the people who live in places like Union Beach and the people who own investment properties in places like Long Beach Island, which is not everybody there, but a significant amount of the population there, or the infrastructure. And yeah, in terms of reaching them, I mean, there are different ways, I think, of thinking about that question. I mean, the film is on DirecTV, so that was great, and that reaches, obviously, in theory, reaches people across a geographic spectrum of the country. But I think, to me, okay, so the way that I think you can most effectively get people to pay attention to climate change is on economic terms. And I think, for me, I think I mentioned this, in my talk. I am someone who grew up valuing the intrinsic, qualities of nature and the environment, and those are really important to me. That's on a gut level, emotionally, how I feel about it, and where my concerns come from, and then as I also mentioned, I understand the economic piece to this. But if you are someone who has an investment property on the coastline, and you are hearing that there's the potential for a beach replenishment project to either happen or not happen, or you're considering making an investment on the coast, that kind of a decision is going to be a pretty important one to you. I mean, the federal flood insurance program is very important and does subsidize development and encourage development in these places. But if you own a $5 million house, that subsidy is pretty small comparatively. It maxes out at $250,000. So while that's important, I think some of the bigger questions about, like, beach replenishment, whether or not this is going to be a perpetual program, because right now the federal program is authorized in 50-year increments. When you get a federal Army Corps program, it's a plan that's based on 50 years, and it's authorized for that amount of time. It's not to say the money is put in place for it, but you can continue to do it. So if you're looking at a community where it's either up for reauthorization, which there are some that are just starting to come up for that, or you're looking at whether or not to do it in the first place, that would really impact on people's decision to build in these places or not build in these places. And also just this question of how the money is apportioned right now. As we say in the film, it's less than 10% on a local level is what is required for these replenishment projects. The rest is covered partly by the state and the bulk of it by the federal government. I mean, after Hurricane Sandy, the money that was there for beach replenishment, actually all that local contribution was waived. It was 100% federal and state. And so, that doesn't send a cautionary signal to people. So, not to hammer away at the money too much, but I think it's a really important piece of this conversation, because if they're an investment property, at the end of the day, that's what they are, as an investment. And so in order to change people's behavior, I think you have to change the mindset around that. In North Carolina, it's gone the opposite direction right now, or it's going in the opposite direction.
Okay, great. Thank you for those thoughts. And that dovetails well with another question that just came in. Do you have any suggestions on how to communicate climate change to the general public, say in Florida, where the state government refuses to acknowledge the issue? And I think you probably just hit on that with talking about pocketbook issues or just financial issues in general. Do you have anything else that you want to add? And then I have a couple of things that I could throw in to suggest after you.
Yeah. So there are plenty of other ways I think to communicate this stuff, and there are some things that are more. There's economics, and then there are different things I think appeal to different people in different ways. And so, there's a group that I met up with and that helped me on some screenings in I guess it's called Southwest Florida, sort of St. Petersburg area, and they have an organization called Rising Seas, and they do a great job in both lots of different events and also in a number of different public ways of getting people to think about what sea level rise is going to look like. And sometimes it's very literal. They do some great work when they go to a local screening or my film, but also when they do in a local event, they make a poster where they do a overlay of a very recognizable location in, say, St. Petersburg, and then they juxtapose over that what sea level rise will look like, and not just on a topographical map that can be a little bit abstract, but on an actual photograph. And so they have these great GPS GPS overlay, who knows what it is exactly, in Adobe Photoshop, I think, where you can actually very accurately plot what, say, 3 feet of sea level rise will look like, and they put in some semi-opaque water to show you what the center of town will look like at whatever it is, 2100 or 2050 or 2030, just so people have some idea. And that's one way of visualizing it. Another, there's a woman named Eve Mosher who does this thing called the High Water Mark Project or High Water Project. Anyway, she does this in a couple of different locations. She does a very intensive community building project where part of which is where she comes in with one of those chalk machines, which is they use for painting the lines on baseball fields or football fields. She goes around and with some community groups does the very public delineation of where that high water line would be, again, at some date chosen in the future, where you take a consensus sea level rise estimate and plot it out there. And so that's another way. And with these things, the more you can get them covered in the media, obviously, the better. It just helps people think about things a little bit differently. And I have my own ideas about how to do this, and outside of film as well. And I mean, personally, I want to figure out how to compel every elected official in the United States to write an open letter to their child or grandchild, explaining their position on climate change and climate change policy at this point, so that be out there publicly for all eternity. And so I just think there needs to be a certain amount of accountability that's not just based on the next 2 years, basically.
Okay, great. And then also the other thing I wanted to add on to that is that there's a great website on messaging specifically called climateaccess.org, and they have all sorts of resources available on effective communication about climate change to the public. So that's a great resource to look into. Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of research out there about what works and what doesn't work at this point.
Right.
I think it's sometimes counterintuitive to those of us who don't think about whether or not we should be worried about these things. But yeah, it's good to know what the researchers are saying.
Yeah, right. Okay, now here I'm going to just roll 2 questions together here. You mentioned that Maryland is diverting development away from the coast. Do you know how they're doing that? How did they get buy-in from the business community? And then along with that, let's tie in this other question of do you have any other public advocacy success stories at the local level that you found out about that you feel are inspiring and would like to share?
Okay, so I'll tackle the first one first. In Maryland, Zoe Johnson is the head of the, I guess they call it, it's the DNCR there, I think, Department of Natural Resource, Conservation of Natural Resources. And she, is a climate scientist. And the governor of Maryland is not a denier. And that's the most important starting point, I think, here. And they work very closely together. I mean, she, like I said, that she was involved with, that they're doing work with the emergency, that runs from emergency management to long-term sea level rise planning. And she is very involved. Like when there is a storm coming, she's in, their war room. She's very essential part of the team, and they see these things as connected, and they are connected. And so I think, I can't speak to how they got buy-in from the business community, but one of the things they're able to do, first and foremost, is start with basically they're able to start by looking at how they can make changes based on dealing with the storm. And the things that you do to deal with the storm are also things that you can put in play to make incremental changes towards resilience on the coast and towards resilience in your infrastructure. And so with parks, anything that comes under the state purview, where the state gets to make unilateral decisions, they're able to then make those decisions, which then lead other businesses and community leaders to both reflect on their own city and urban planning, but also in coastal planning, but also kind of influence them in pretty direct ways. And so they tie together both the emergency planning and the long-term planning. So, for instance, they have state what do you call it, like both parks, but also historic sites and other things. And if their information, their research, consensus science is telling them that they're basically going to be underwater in 30 to 50 years, they're not make investments in them anymore. They're going to let them, they're going to move them, or they're going to let them, they're going to go with nature on that. So, I think the collaboration is what's really important, and the trust and the acceptance of science. But I mean, I know even in Maryland, they've been very careful about how they word their legislation and their policies, so as to avoid certain red flags that other people outside groups will latch onto. And I know in Virginia, this is not a good example, but shortly after North Carolina passed their piece of legislation that sort of kicked the can down the road on planning for sea level rise, Virginia made it, I guess not illegal, but they made it so that you could not use the word sea level rise in official policy documents. Instead, you had to use the term recurrent flooding, which, I mean, it just goes to show that, language can be really important. And I think that being respectful of that and understanding that, and not just to suggest that one should try to sneak things in places, but I think you do have to be careful about words that set people off psychologically. So there's that. And then in terms of other local success stories, I mean, there are success stories in the wake of Hurricane Sandy in New Jersey. There are a lot of recovery projects that are looking longer term. The New Jersey, I think it's called the Recovery Fund, has funded a number of really good local projects that are based on building community consensus. And New York has done some really good work around this. New York has hosted, in New York, they've had a number of different design competitions. New York City is, really out on the forefront of this. They had a 5-year, basically like a 5-year think tank that was 4 years in the works, or even more, before Hurricane Sandy, dealing with how the city will deal with sea level rise. And they have this incredible document online that I can't say I read the whole thing because it's 450 pages long, but you can find it on I think it's the city of New York, not the state, but detailing all of the ideas that they have for how they're going to build resilience in the city. But that's, like I was saying in the talk, the difference between the way that they're thinking there and the way that, say, leaders in Miami might be thinking is also based on geomorphology and the fact that New York's built on bedrock and has a subway system and has to deal with all these unique local criteria, and also the fact that New York is going to spend every dollar they can possibly find, staying where they are. They're not moving New York. Miami may have a different scenario. It doesn't have the same kind of, economic investment and value that New York does. And it's also just much harder to protect. But the mayor of Miami Beach is a outspoken advocate for planning for the future. I know the mayor in Nags Head, or the town manager, Clive Ogden, Cliff Ogden, is also really out front trying to get a handle on this stuff. And there are folks. There's someone, Cameron Adibi in Gloucester, Mass, who is working really hard to bring people together there to pay attention. I know on Martha's Vineyard there's nascent movement, but a lot of these things it's hard to call them success stories because they've really just begun. But I think really connecting people from different communities to each other so that they can see what other people are, where they're finding success and where they're not, is really important. But in the end of the day, it does come down to the fact that each region and location is going to have to deal with the particulars of their backyard.
Okay, great perspectives. Thanks, Ben. All right, let's see. We're closing down on our last few questions. We have about 10 minutes left. Thank you all for being so participatory here and submitting lots of questions. This is a great discussion. And if you have any more questions, you can submit them via the control panel on the right-hand side of the screen. We will try to answer any questions via email follow-up if we don't get to them on the line here today. And the other thing is, make sure that you take note of the information on the screen right now, which is how to get a hold of Ben directly at his email address, how to sign up for the very occasional newsletter at shoredupmovie.com, and how to organize screenings, order DVDs, etc. That's all on the screen right now. So now I think it sounds like you touched on this a little bit, but we have a question about how do you prevent foolhardy use of public funds, such as loan guarantees for economic development, to support reckless oceanfront projects? It sounds like you kind of presented maybe some alternative models that are more progressive thinking, but do you have any more ideas on that question?
So I guess, yeah, I mean, well, I would say also that a great resource for things along those lines is Taxpayers for Common Sense. Steve Ellis is in the film, and he talks a lot about this. And he talks about this, the idea that a subsidy is something that you want more of. And so, as we subsidize all this development along the coast, is this really something we want more of? That's a good one to, sort of lodge in your brain somewhere, I think. But at least when you're talking to people. But I think so. There are some other interesting things out there. One of which is called the Coastal Barrier Resources Act, and this is one that is coming up. Actually, there are some people who are now trying to overturn this act, but it's a really interesting piece of legislation. I recommend you check it out at some point. Google it. Signed by Ronald Reagan. Sort of one of these very, nowadays very rare occasions when you'd have a very, conservative Republican and embracing something that both meets conservative fiscal ideas, but also, an idea of conservation of natural resources. And what the Coastal Barrier Resources Act did was it set aside large parts of the coast that had not been developed and said these areas are now part of this zone, and if you build in these areas, you can build in these areas, but if you do, there will be no federal resources available to you after a storm or after, in other environmental predictable damage. So basically what it's doing is it's taking almost all of the subsidies out of the equation. So the Stafford Act, which is what happens after a storm when the government, FEMA comes in and brings in disaster relief, that money is not available to you. Federal flood insurance not available to you. General aid from FEMA not available. And so what you see is that this was back in, now it's been, I think, almost 30 years. It's actually pretty successful. A lot of the places that were a part of that are still relatively undeveloped. Now, there are some places like Topsail Beach, which are part of that, which have developed quite a bit. And I believe Topsail Beach, if not a couple, and if not them, some other similar communities are the ones who are now pushing to get removed from this act. Which is really kind of amazing, but not surprising maybe, but amazing, especially considering the fact that that was 30 years ago. Pretty forward-thinking piece of legislation, but now knowing what we know, the idea that you would go and kind of undercut that, in fact, just makes no sense. Another thing to think about is some of the laws that North Carolina, because I'm more familiar with their laws, having spent some time there than other states, have in place, or at least the ones that they may not have in place for much longer, but have in place now. One of which is that if you are in a flood zone and your house is damaged more than 50%, so it would take more than 50% of the value to repair the house, you're simply not allowed to rebuild in that place anymore. And the idea is to start it creates like a managed retreat, which is retreat is a word that it's one of those buzzwords you got to watch out for, because that triggers people. But the idea is that this is a way of helping to build a buffer zone where there should be a buffer zone. And in Nag's Head, there was a row of homes that were the first row on the water that were condemned after Hurricane Irene. And by all rights, they should be torn down, and the town went to try to tear them down to follow the laws that were in place, and they're being sued by the homeowners who want to rebuild those homes, even though it's pretty plain that they, according to the law and according to common sense, they shouldn't be there anymore. So, it's very tricky.
Okay, great. Well, those are some really good leads there. Thank you for that. We have a couple comments from Virginia. Love the movie. Have you been to Virginia with the film, either on the Eastern Shore or the Norfolk area? And if not, how can we get you there? Which you kind of have already gone through. And then another comment from Virginia. In Eastern Virginia, there's very high rate of land subsidence in the Chesapeake Bay region, so that the Navy has to spend billions of dollars to raise its own piers in Norfolk. Do you think this is a good example of the cost of improving infrastructure because of climate change?
Yeah. So I did one screening in Christopher Newport University, Newport News, which was great. Had a huge turnout. And I'd love to do more screenings there. So, if we can figure out how to, a lot of times, for anyone for me to get someplace, there are some expenses involved, but finding universities or sponsors like that can be a really good way to do it. So, just to plant that seed, if there are people who have associations with colleges or universities, that's often a good way, and it also provides a venue and some good tie-ins. So in these issues are front and center in Virginia if people care to think about them. And the Navy is, and the armed forces in general are some of the most pragmatic, thinkers out there, and there's very little debate, I think, in at least in the planning levels in the armed forces about whether or not climate change is real and whether or not it's happening. It's quite the opposite. They may have an enormous carbon footprint, but they're actually working pretty quickly to reduce that. In particular, the Navy, both because it's convenient because they can have nuclear-powered subs and ships, but also because for all the branches of the military, they understand and recognize and have studied and published about the very destabilizing effects that they anticipate from both drought, flooding, sea level rise, and all of these issues. And that's their wheelhouse. That's what they have to deal with. And the Navy in particular, more than any other branch, like you suggested, are literally on the front lines of this, and they are witnessing it and having to plan for it. Their entire infrastructure, the Navy, is built at the edge of where land and sea meet. So they're a really good example, and particularly in Virginia, where they have a pretty heavy investment. So For whatever it's worth, definitely pay attention to what the Navy's doing. I actually had started working on a film as a producer that was going to be called Accidental Success, which was the term created to explain what happens when a technology goes from military development into the public sector, which is everything that we use, from jet engines to microwaves. And the idea was that they're on the leading edge of developing clean tech, technologies and implementing them, because it is such a central issue to their success. So, yeah, those are good questions.
Excellent. Okay. Well, we are unfortunately out of time for questions. Ben, thank you so much for the excellent presentation, for your great work with the film, and for answering all of our questions with such excellent responses. Aaron, do you want to wrap us up here?
Sure, Chris. Yep. Thank you so much, Ben, for being with us today. And Chris, thank you as well, and everybody for attending today's Southeast Coastal Climate Network webinar. SACE is very excited to take part in this webinar series. We'd also like to thank all of our members on this call and encourage those of you who are not members to join us today. For more information, please check out our website, cleanenergy.org, and I encourage you to also view our blog or follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Today's presentation will also be available on the webinar archive page of our website, and we will provide a link in the follow-up email that we will send following this webinar today, as well as a list of all of the links that Ben also had included on the last slide of his presentation. And that's all that I have. So have a good day, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.